And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we are going to build off of the previous podcast where we had the supply and demand curves in equilibrium with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And now we're going to ask what happens if a curve shifts? What happens if we get a change in one of the curves? And on this video, we're very much just going to go through the mechanics. So we're really not going to be explaining the economic intuition. We're just going to go through the mechanics of shifting curves. So there's four things that can happen when one curve shifts. So we're going to shift just one curve at a time, and we're going to do it 4 different times. The first thing that can happen is you can get an increase in demand. Now please remember this, and if you're taking notes on this, you ought to write it down to yourself, but put a little highlight next to it, star it or something. Increase means right, and decrease means left. So increase means right, decrease means left, and that's going to tell you which way the curve shifts. Increase is right, decrease is left. So let's look at this first one. The first one over here says increase demand. So what does increased demand mean? Well, remember, demand means that the curve shifts. We saw that on a previous video. And I just told you that increase means right. So what we're going to do is shift the demand curve to the right. Let me just redraw that. We're going to shift the demand curve to the right. And we're going to call that demand curve D2. And then what you do is you find the new equilibrium point. The new equilibrium point is going to be where the new demand curve, D2, intersects the supply curve, which did not move, and that's going to be this point right here. And then you come across and you mark what the new price is. New price is going to be, we'll call it P2, which is higher than P1. And then the new quantity is going to be Q2, which is also higher than Q1. And then we would record everything that happened. So what is everything that happened? Well, everything that happened was we had an increase in demand. So there's my shorthand for that. Increase D, increased demand. We have let's see, what happened on the supply side? Well, on the supply side of the market, you can see right here that we moved along the supply curve. You see that we moved along the supply curve, and that arrow is pointing to the right. So it's an increase in quantity supplied, and that's kind of a hard idea, and it'll take a little bit of time and practice for you to get it, but you will. So we had an increase in demand because the demand curve shifted right. We had an increase in the quantity supplied because we moved along the supply curve. Quantity increased, we moved along the supply curve. That's increased quantity supplied. And then over here the price went up, so we say increased price. And over here the quantity increased from Q1 to Q2 going to the right. So we had increased quantity. So those are the 4 things that we can say. When you get an increase in demand, the demand curve will shift to the right, and that will cause these 4 things to happen. Increased demand, increased quantity supplied, increased price, increased quantity. Okay? Those are the 4 things that can happen. Let's look at the second possibility. That's this graph where you get a decrease in demand. All right, demand, that means that the demand curve is going to shift. Decrease means it's going to go to the left, so you're going to get a decrease in demand. The demand curve is going to shift into the left. That's a decrease in demand. Find your new equilibrium point, which is where the new demand curve hits the old supply curve. Label your new price, which is going to be P2. Label your new quantity, which is going to be Q2. And then let's record the 4 things that happen. Whenever you get a decrease in demand, okay, so that's a decrease in demand. That's going to cause you to move along the supply curve. There it is, moving along the supply curve. Okay, and that we move to the left along the supply curve, so that's called a decrease in quantity supplied, right? Because the supply curve didn't shift. It didn't it didn't move. We moved along the supply curve. Okay, remember from the previous video, that's a change in quantity supplied. Then what happened to the price? Well, the price went down, so that's a decreased price, and the quantity went down, so that's a decreased quantity. Those are the four things that we can say. Those are the four things that we can say. So we have increased demand, decreased demand. On the next video, we'll look at what happens when the supply curve shifts. So we'll look at increase supply and decrease supply. We'll look at that on the next video. There's been another podcast with Mr. Hagan. See you on the next podcast.